Let's get a little bit of strategy. Let's get our 2 pages. Enmeshed in such endlessly decisive, hair-splitting debates as a formative experience, he noted, we learned a distrust and hostility towards the very people we were closest to historically, the representatives of the liberal and labor organizations who had once been young radicals themselves. The old leftists, in turn, were shocked by the indifference of the young activists to the working class cause and the unions, and the reluctance to get drawn into denunciations of communism. Instead of the rigorous analysis of classic tests, the new radicals were suspicious of theory. Political acts had to be genuine expressions of values and sentiments. Convictions took priority over the calculation of consequences, reflecting a wariness of expediency and a refusal to compromise for the sake of political effects. At times it seemed as if deliberate and systematic thought was suspect. Only a spontaneous stream of consciousness, however inarticulate and unintelligible, could be trusted. Todd Gitlin, an early activist and later analyst of the New Left, observed how actions were undertaken to dramatize convictions. They were judged according to how they made the participants feel, as if they were drugs offering highs and lows. If it was the immediate experience which counted for most, then there was little slope for thinking about the long term. This left the new radicals caught by Weber's paradox. Though Weber was dispirited by the steady bureaucratization of society and politics, he considered it irresponsible to ignore the logic of functionality. The emerging political form of the new radicals embraced an ethic of responsibility. There could be no separation of means and ends. Every compromise, every denial of core value meant that something precious had been lost, diminishing whatever might eventually be achieved. Their tactics, highlighted by the sit-in, instinctively challenged all rules. They were often strikingly lacking in both theory and organization, reveling in activism, but without a clear direction. The underlying philosophy was existentialist rather than socialist. This experiment in existential strategy failed because those features that made it so culturally liberating. This experiment in existential strategy failed because those features that made it so culturally liberating, and where the effects were actually long lasting, also made it politically exasperating when positions were articulated in terms of core values rather than alternate outcomes. Compromises were hard to arrange and coalitions became fragile. Without hierarchy, whenever decision was subject to constant challenge and re-examination, organization became slow and ponderous and implementation tentative. The activists, doubting rationality and trusting feelings, became increasingly angry. Their distaste for the politics of expedience and compromise led to isolation and irrelevance and vulnerability to the intervention of groups based on hard theory and disciplined organization against which they had initially rebelled. Instead of the polarized class struggle anticipated by Marx, post-war capitalist society was marked by an improved standard of living, apparently developing into a self-satisfied but undifferentiated mass society. The salaried middle classes were on the ascendant, largely to be found in large impersonal organizations. The daily grind of life was hardly grueling, yet there appeared to be something missing. The critique was not of growing misery and poverty, but of dreariness, not so much physical deprivation, but of a psychological void. William White's The Organization Man suggests a degree of homogenization in the American middle class, reflected in standardized career paths, consumer tastes, and cultural sensibilities, with an accompanying degree of docility. The fault, he argued, was not an organization but its worship, the soft-minded denial that there is a conflict between the individual and society. Indeed, much of the writing about this group, including David Riesman's The Lonely Crowd and C. Wright Mills' White Collar Workers, suggested that the rise of this class was joyless. Riesman argued that inner directed personalities followed life goals established at an early age. Riesman argued that inner-directed personalities followed life goals established at an early age, had a strong sense of values, and were therefore apt to suffer from guilt when deviating from those values. Wow. Okay, so Riesman argued that inner-directed personalities followed life goals established at an early age, had a strong sense of values, and were therefore apt to suffer from guilt when deviating from those values. They were giving way to other directed personalities who took cues from their environment and were dependent on their contemporaries or even the media for direction. The distinction was between following either in internal gyroscope or in external radar. The Lonely Crowd became one of the most popular books ever written by a sociologist, in contrast to the earlier progressives who looked to other directedness as a means of binding society together and encouraging a democratic society. Encouraged the view probably more than Riesman's intended, and there was something pernicious about social conventions and political orthodoxy as uncritically transmitted through the mass media. The idea that adapting to the social environment risks denying core values was also a theme of Erich Fromm's Fear of Freedom. Fromm, a refugee from Nazi Germany, warned of the dangers of rootless individuals seeking security in conformism or authoritarianism. Freedom had to be about more than lack of restrictions. It needed to be more positive, creative, authentic, expressive, and spontaneous, as well as freedom had to be more. Freedom had to be about more than lack of restrictions. It needed to be positive, creative, authentic, expressive, and spontaneous, as well as less respectful of the received wisdom of experts or the dictates of common sense. Social structures were presented as oppressing the natural positive side of human nature rather than restraining the negative cohesive side. The enthusiasts for the cultural development of the 1960s saw it as an affirmation of this positive side of human nature against the conformism of